Hey guys, welcome back. Chris here with WeBuyGuns.com. Welcome back to another weekly used gun review. We are here at episode 100. So in the past, we have looked at between 700 and 800 different firearms on this type of video. Thank you guys so much for sticking with me all the way through 100 episodes. I know over about the past 7 or 8 months, these videos have been coming out very slow, but as I mentioned in the last 2 weekly used gun review videos, I've set up an at-home studio. So I'm trying to get back to the weekly nature of the weekly used gun review. So again, big thanks for sticking with me. This is a big milestone. So let's kick this video off with some more cool firearms. Now remember, the format of this video is we're going to start with most common and move through least common as the video progresses, starting us off with our first firearm. What I have here is a firearm I actually did a video about, I want to say like 4 years ago, talking about some of the top 5 best value 1911s or something. And this was actually on that list, and it is still in my top 5, best value 1911s out there. This is the Bull Armory 1911. This one is the G model or government model. It is stainless and it is 9mm. Now this one comes to us from a local customer, so big thank you for selling us this one. Now Bull Armory is actually based out of Israel, and they were founded in the year 1990. They came out with a 1911 pattern back then known as the M5, and they've since really focused on their craft with 1911 firearms. Now they have their basic consumer models, their base models like this, and actually you call it a base model, but it's really fully loaded, and I'll talk about that here in a minute. But they also have a range of competition firearms and things like that. And they really are competitive in terms of their price point for what you're getting. Now, they would actually be brought into the country, and if we get into the C, the G, and the officer's model as well, those were brought into the United States by Magnum Research. Now, Magnum Research is based out of Minnesota. Now, they got their start back in the 1970s, and they had worked with, at the time, IWI, and perfecting and also manufacturing the Desert Eagle, the large 50 Action Express firearm that everybody knows, made popular by such movies as The Matrix and others as well in video games. They had switched over to a different manufacturer that went back to IWI. Now, IWI is also based out of Israel. That's Israeli Weapons Industries. And they have been at the forefront of some of the world's best arms design and technologies. They would manufacture things like the Uzi, as well as now the Tavor series of rifles. Now, because Magnum Research had a relationship with a really large Israeli company, they would also somewhere along the lines get introduced to Bull Limited. Now, Bull, again, is manufactured in Israel, and they were making these really nice, high-quality 1911s at a really competitive price. So somewhere about a decade ago, Magnum Research would start bringing these into the country, again, as the commander, the officer, and the government size. The 5-inch for government, about 4.3 for the commander, and about 3.5 for the officer, offering them in blued and stainless like this in both 9mm and 45 ACP. Now, when they started being manufactured and sold, they were somewhere around $700 to $800 new. Now, keep in mind other firearms that are more assembly line 1911s, like the line from Springfield or the Ruger SR 1911 or the Remington R1 series. Those were selling at about the same price for their base entry-level models. Now, those, of course, have higher-end versions that sell in around the $1,000 range, that have things like upgraded grips and triggers and sights and forward serrations and beaver tail safeties that are extended skeletonized features. But the base model from Magnum Research, actually manufactured by Bull in Israel, had all those features on it on the base model. So you're getting things like really nice G10 grips, extended beaver tail safety, skeletonized components, forward slide serrations, nice kind of Novak style combat sights. The best thing about these is that fit and finish is remarkable, and the trigger, the trigger pull rivals $1,500 1911. The trigger pull is so light, so crisp, really, really light reset. This is like a match or competition trigger, in my opinion. And to find it stock in a firearm at the price, this was just a massive winner. And when I did that video about 4 or 5 years ago, I still am thrilled with these firearms. Well, Bull would since come out with their own importation facility in Florida, so they are now bringing them in themselves. So if you see a Magnum Research 1911 or a Bull 1911, they are the exact same firearm made by Bull. It's just going to have different roll markings and things like that. Now, new today on the market, they've gone up a little bit, okay? So when these were coming in for a while, they didn't do a whole lot in terms of advertising. I mean, we carried these in our store and everybody would see them, would like not even know what they were and just look them over and pick up a Ruger or a Remington that's sitting right next to it for more money. And honestly, I think less of a gun. We would pull these out and put them in their hands and people would be like blown away by them, and we would sell them like crazy once, our local market started knowing about them. And so since then, I think there's more market awareness of these firearms. There's, a lot more people looking for them. They have become somewhat more difficult to find. I don't know why. But anyway, the pricing has gone up. So new, they're around $1,000. Remember, pricing on everything's kind of gone up a little bit over the past few years. Used, you should be able to find them in the 7 to 8, and depending on condition and what they come with, stainless finish is going to go for a little bit higher than the blued. But anyway, just a fantastic 1911. I cannot recommend these enough. So again, really happy to start this video off with one of my favorite 1911s. That is the Bull Limited at 1911. This is the G model or government model. Okay, up next we have a pistol from a series of Smith & Wesson handguns that I am personally very fond of. This is a Smith & Wesson model 4013 TSW. TSW standing for Tactical Smith & Wesson. I'll talk a little bit about nomenclature and model numbers and stuff like that as we get through this, as it can actually be kind of complicated. Now this one comes to us from a viewer in Pennsylvania. It's a big thank you for selling this one to us. This is a 40 Smith & Wesson caliber double stack magazine holding 9 rounds. It is really the sort of compact version of the 4006 TSW, the tactical, which was actually popularly used by the California Highway Patrol. Now the third generation Smith & Wesson pistols were very popular through the late 80s and through the 90s as police service sidearms. And again, we'll go through that element of the history of this pistol. Now, the story with the third generation Smith & Wesson would actually begin with the first generation Smith & Wesson pistols, which would get their debut after World War II. Now, during the Second World War, of course, the United States is issuing the 1911 A1 service sidearm and 45 ACP single action only, feeding from a detachable 7-round box magazine. Now, at the same time, obviously in the ETO, the United States was facing off against Germany, who is issuing, amongst other sidearms, the very venerable P38 pistol, double single action, firing with an exposed hammer, had a decocker safety on it, and fed from an 8-round detachable box magazine, single stack magazine. Now, people at the Ordnance Board in the United States were actually very impressed with the P38 pistol. It would be a little bit of a foreshadow to the adoption of the Beretta M9 in the 1980s, which took a lot of its design cues and elements from the P38 pistol itself, but I digress. Now, because of this technology and NATO testing that had been done at the conclusion of the Second World War, showing, a side that had an opportunity to produce a higher volume of fire during any type of battle engagement was more likely to win, the United States was not only interested in moving away from the 1911 design, but also potentially into a smaller caliber. Now, in anticipation of this trials, Smith & Wesson would actually come out with a new semi-automatic pistol design, which would be dubbed later the Model 39. Now, this would mark the introduction of the first generation of semi-automatic pistol designs by Smith & Wesson, and this would be in the year 1954. Now, it would have an alloy frame. It itself would feed from a detachable 8-round box magazine like the P38. It would use a trigger system, had a little bit of stacking to the trigger, which is one of its hindrances during testing. Those who tested with the 45 1911 liked the single action nature of the trigger. It was much easier to get more accurate and quicker follow-up shots. So the United States would actually shy away from going into a new pistol at that time, sticking with the 1911 again until it was replaced in the 1980s by the M9 double stack, double single action sidearm. Now, Smith & Wesson would actually then introduce this pistol technology to the commercial market, where it actually saw a lot of success. Remember, the 1950s, semi-automatic pistol technology was relatively nascent. You did have the emergence of sidearms from the Second World War, of course, one of the biggest ones being the high power. But still in this time, both civilly and with law enforcement, a lot of people are still using Smith Model 10s and other type of revolvers. So kind of new semi-automatic technology is starting to catch on after the Second World War, and the Model 39 is definitely one of those getting the attention of the public. If we switch over to the Navy also thought about changing its sidearm that it was issuing in the 1970s. So in 1970, the Navy of the United States military would actually go to Smith & Wesson and say, hey, can you take this Model 39 and make it a double stack pistol and let it accept high power magazines, which are, higher capacity and there's widely available on the market. So Smith & Wesson would take the task, redesign the Model 39 into the Model 59 double stack sidearm and submit it to the Navy for trials. Now, through special operation seals and things like that, they did some testing and again decided to not go ahead with the Smith & Wesson design. So because Smith & Wesson already had the R&D completed on the Model 59, they would again release it to the commercial market where again it saw a lot of success. Now, through the 1970s, the Model 59 is doing very well. So Smith & Wesson decides to expand on the 59 offering. So in 1979, they revamped some of the machining characteristics and trigger characteristics of the design and reissue the single stack Model 39 and double stack Model 59 as the models 439 and 459, adding a third digit, and this would mark the introduction of the second generation in 1979. They would also introduce a 45 Smith & Wesson pistol, which fed from an 8-round single stack box magazine, which they called it the 645. Again, starting to get a lot of spark within the commercial market, it would actually get the attention of Wayne Novak of Novak Sights. Now, he would make some recommendations to the improvement of the design in about the mid-1980s. These improvements would be a wraparound grip like this. Now, previous models would have a squared-off trigger guard. He liked the idea of a rounded-off trigger guard, which meant, you could made the trigger face more usable to the shooter. He wanted the sights to actually be dovetailed instead of fixed. So you see dovetailed sights here. The implementation of his ramped 3-dot Novak sights. And that was basically it. Now that would then introduce in the late 80s the third generation, and from there the model offerings became massive. On most of the models they would add 2 more digits, so you go to a 4-digit model like this one is the 4013 TSW, and I'll roll up a chart of all the different models that they offered. But through the nomenclature, the numbering system, you would indicate the caliber, the finish on the frame, whether it was blued or stainless, whether it was an alloy or steel frame, or whether it was double or single action. I think those are basically what the 4 digits, what they indicated for those elements of the pistol. Now, in 1997, Smith & Wesson would introduce this pistol. This is the 4013 TSW. Now, as mentioned, the TSW is tactical Smith & Wesson. So, as this differs from the standard 4013, as they would widen this one to a double stack, lengthen the slide, and add an accessory rear. Now, the 4006 was a longer, full-size version of this pistol, the 4006 TSW, which had the accessory rail and stuff like that, and those were popularly used through law enforcement. Now, part of the third series were like the 5903 and 5906, which were also, those were 9mm. Those were heavily used by law enforcement. You have 45 caliber versions, 10mm versions. So just the product offerings on these were huge. Now, through the 1990s, these were a massive staple with law enforcement. Okay, like this is what all police departments were basically trading in their Model 10s to go to the third generation Smith & Wesson pistols. So through the 1990s, these are the dominant players. Now, around that time as well, Glock is starting to get a foothold in the United States market. They start doing trade-in programs where you could trade in, old, worn-out police, third-gen, heavier frame steel and alloy frame guns for the new polymer Wonder 9s and 40s and 45s. And the rest would sort of seal the fate of the third gens. These would start being phased out in the mid, like 2003 through about 2008. That's when these are starting to widely be phased out in replacement of the Glock. Mainly the Glock Model 22. The 40 caliber is what police departments tended to want at that time. Because of that, there were commercial versions and there were law enforcement versions, surplus guns, and all ranging scales of condition. You've seen a lot of them come out as surplus on the market, and even foreign governments had used them as police service sidearms. So you have imported versions coming in from places like Israel as well. So the pricing on all the different, 5903s and 06s and the 4006s and all of that stuff varies widely. There are third-gen Smiths that can go over $1,000. You can get third-gen Smiths for $300, so it just depends on what it is. This particular one, the 40s in general are a little bit on the lower end of the totem pole, $400 to $500-ish. And that's about where most third-gen Smiths are, in about the $400 to $500 range. But there are some that go for more, some that go for less. But anyway, very cool pistol. Very happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. That is a Smith & Wesson 4013 TSW, third generation Smith & Wesson handgun. Okay, up next is a very popular and very antiquated target pistol that comes to us from a local customer. So big thank you for selling this one to us. This is the Colt target model, also known to a lot of people as the Colt Woodsman, although this specific one does predate the Woodsman, which again collectors know as the pre-Woodsman. And I'll explain sort of the history and the differences as we go along. Now, the story with this would begin prior to 1915 with the famous arms designer John Moses Browning. Now, he had come up with a series of very successful sidearms, most notably the 1911, which had gone into service in the United States military in the year 1911. Now, keeping in line with the 11-degree grip angle and the somewhat similar target aspects of that series of pistols, John Moses Browning wanted to come up with a rimfire target model that could be used for law enforcement, for military, as well as the civilian population for target recreational purposes. So he would get to work, and in 1915, he would come up with this design. This was first known as the Colt target model, as produced and distributed by Colt. Now, the target model would initially feature a 6-inch barrel, would have a beautiful blued finish, and then these sort of walnut checkered grips with the diamond cuts around the grip screws. There would be different variations of this that would come out. In 1933, they would have a sports model with a 4-inch barrel meant for recreation, hiking, and camping. And they would come out with a match model in 1938, which would have a heavy profile barrel with one-piece wraparound walnut grips. Now, in the period of 1915 to 1927, again, this was known as the target model. And in 1927, really without any type of changes to the design, they would give this the name the Woodsman. And that's how most people know about this pistol, as they know it as the Woodsman. Now, again, collectors would call the 1915 to 1926 manufactured guns the pre-Woodsman. This one was made in 1921, and this one actually has a 6 1/4 inch length barrel. Most of them were 6 inches. I've seen some with nearly 7 inches, some 6 1/4. I don't know why, maybe special orders or changes that were done for different, production reasons. I'm not 100% certain there. Now, these would be made in a variation of what are known, again, by collectors as 3 series of the Woodsman. The first series would date 1915 from inception to 1941 with the beginning of World War II. Now, like most other arms designers, Colt included, they would cease production on their commercial sidearms and focus on their military production. This would be true of Colt as well. Now, Colt had a massive manufacturing agreement for the 1911 A1 sidearm, so they were focused mainly on working on those, although some of the Woodsman models would actually go into World War II service with limited application for training purposes and things like that. A lot of those are marked United States property, so you can actually find Colt Woodsman pistols marked United States property out there on the market today. And they demand a little bit of a premium because of their military connection there as well. Now, after the conclusion of the Second World War, Colt would come out with what is known as the second series of the Woodman, and this would resume production in 1948. Now, they would make a couple subtle revisions to the design. First of all, in the first generation of the Woodsman, the magazine release is down here at the heel, typically known as the European style. American style is known as a button mag release, which they would actually incorporate into the second design. You would also have a magazine safety, and you would have an automatic slide stop. Now, the slide stop on the first pattern is manual, as you can see here, so you can push the slide open and push the slide stop up into a little catch groove here. On the second pattern, they would move to an automatic design with a little spring actuator in there, so when you pull the slide back, it would just lock itself open. Now, during this period, again through the second series, this is 1948 to 1955, they would introduce the Challenger model. Now, the Challenger model was an economized version, which would actually, they would remove the mag release, and on the Challenger model, keep it actually down here at the heel. And the Challenger model would also have fixed sights, so the typical sights on the Woodsman were adjustable like these. They would just be fixed machine sights onto the Challenger model. Now, in 1955, they would make a couple revisions again, namely moving the magazine release from the side of the gun back down to the heel like we had on the first generation, or the first series Woodman, and the Challenger models as well. They would also during this time introduce the Huntsman model, which was again a further simplified and economized version. Now you would have plastic grips at this period in time with a thumb rest on it. You could get the option of going to the walnut if you wanted to do that. But all the basic models, the target models, the sports models, and the competition models were still available through all three series of the gun. Now in 1977, they would actually discontinue production of the Woodsman pistol, and of course has not been brought back to production since. Now on the market today, you have things like the Buckmark and the Ruger SR22 that are dominating production on the market, and again, there just hasn't really been a place for this, but for rimfire target firearm collectors, the Woodsman has always had needed to have a place in those types of collections. So beautiful, small, lightweight, just it's almost like the gun just points itself. If you've never picked one up or shot one, you would know what I mean. It's just one of the most refined and just aesthetically pleasing and well-balanced target 22s out there. On the market today, through the 3 series and through the different models, I mean, pricing is all over the place, from $300 up to $1,500, depending on what you have. Again, which model, when it was made, its conditions. So there's just like a million factors there to consider. Something like this, probably somewhere there in the middle, $500–600 or so. But anyway, very cool pistol. Happy to get this one in and share it with you guys. That is a Colt Woodsman, or specifically a pre-Woodsman here. Okay, up next is a really nice and interesting pistol that comes to us from a viewer in Texas. So big thank you for selling this one to us. This is a Mauser Model HSC. It is a 32 automatic pistol feeding from a detachable box magazine. Now, an interesting thing about this is when the slide is open, the firearm is empty. The slide locks back to the rear. Pulling back will not release it, and there is no manual release on the pistol itself. You will just insert your magazine and it'll close the slide on its own, chambering your next round. It's a pretty interesting design you don't see on too many pistols today. It does have a manually exposed hammer on the back with a little short nub that you can actuate. It is double single action. Now, the story with this would actually begin back around the First World War. If we look militarily, Germany has always been somewhat of a pistol-intensive country, and this has been exacerbated mainly since about World War I. Now, the doctrine with sidearms is they've been used mainly as a piece of a uniform or a symbol of status, more so than an actual effective military sidearm. Now, I know that's not entirely true. A .08 Luger for its time, it was one of the first fielded semi-automatic pistols. The 9mm Parabellum, which is one of the most widely adopted military handgun cartridges today, was invented by Georg Luger for the .08 Luger design. And things like the P38 were, again, a springboard for so many modern handgun designs. But there were other things that were used mainly from officers, like small caliber 32 and 25 automatic pistols that were, again, mainly used as a status symbol. Of course, also, if we go forward to the Second World War, Germany was mostly an occupational force through the beginning years of the Second World War. As they occupied Austria, or annexed Austria, I should say, occupied Poland, Belgium, France, they needed a lot of sidearms to go around to outfit all the occupational troops and officers that were around, mainly in backline ancillary support roles. And that's where we would get into a very large need of sidearms. But going back to the First World War, Mauser Company had come out with a actually pretty interesting pistol design. They had a 25 automatic and 32 automatic version of the 1910 pistol and 1914 pistols, which are very unique design. I don't have one here to show you, but I will roll up a picture. You can definitely tell by looking at it, it is a little bit antiquated looking, especially if we're getting into the lines of what would be considered World War II technology. A little bit complicated to manufacture, does have a lot of small parts in it, including a small little takedown pin that you have to remove to service the sidearm. So it can be a little bit tedious and difficult to maintain and use, especially as we're getting on through the interwar period. Now, through the 1930s, pocket pistols or personal sidearm pistols are starting to see a sort of a renaissance, a really nice overhaul of new modern technology designs that are actually still seen today. One of which, and probably most popularly, and this is mine, again, I can bring this in and show it to you, is a Walther PPK. Now, the PPK is, again, still around today. It's been made famous by lots of different movies in Hollywood. James Bond, of course. It was a 32 automatic pistol. They made them in 22 as well, and today they make them in 380. It was a straight blowback design, and this itself was a springboard for other modern designs like the Makarov pistols, for example. Nice double single action handgun. Now, because things like this are starting to take shape in the 1930s, The commercial market is sort of going crazy for things like this and the earlier PP versions. Because it is at about the same commercial price point as other former offerings, fewer parts, more elegant design, and more robust and reliable. Sauer would actually in 1938 come out with a design of their own, which would be this, the Sauer 38H pistol, which has some unique features in it, like a decocker and recocking lever here on the side. And a lot of you guys might recognize that from modern day SIG 226 pistols. Manual safety here on the side, also a 32 automatic feeding from a detachable box magazine. So Mauser is starting to sort of look at technology like this and say, hey, you know, our 1914 and later revamped 1934 models aren't quite cutting it. We're starting to lose a lot of market share in the domestic commercial markets. We need to come up with a new design of our own. Furthermore, through 1937 and the rearmament of Germany, pistols like this are starting to get folded into German military service, especially with officer use. They're being purchased privately for military use. And the 1934 model is, again, kind of being left in the dust. So Mauser would go back to the drawing board. They would look at their contemporary competitors, and they would come out with this in 1940. Again, I've already gone over the features with you, but if you look at its relative size, and I know you can't feel it, but the weight is pretty comparable, its capacity, its ease of manufacture, it is falling in line with the more modern era of pocket concealed carry guns. Now, this was intended to be manufactured for the commercial market in Germany. Earlier versions would have a beautiful high polished blued finish. But just like everything else, every other successful pistol design, the German military, especially the Air, the Army, and the Kriegsmarine, the Navy, would take over, put through contracts for military use of these. So that's what this is. This is, got the little Waffen amps on Eagle 135 on here. And these would be put into military service as well. Now, the Luftwaffe and the SS would not actually have contracts of their own, but they would be supplied through the Air, the Army contracts. But these were used widely in German service, as well as, again, the 38H. This has Waffen amps on it as well, and the PPs and the PPK. So these are all service sidearms. Very cool pistols. On the market today, they do range in a wide variety, depending on condition and when it was made. Now, post-World War II, there were commercial versions of this imported by Interarms, so there's going to be a little bit less valuable. But a standard run-of-the-mill military gun like this in this condition might be about $600 or so. It's about where they tend to be. Of course, earlier variations, more rare variations in higher condition will exceed that. And the commercial versions tend to be a little under that. So anyway, very cool pistol. Very happy to get that one in and share it with you guys. That is a Mauser HSC. Okay, up next, I have a very interesting pistol that comes to us from a viewer in South Carolina. So thank you so much for selling this one to us. This is a B&T USWA-1, USW standing for Universal Service Weapon. This is a 9mm semi-automatic pistol built off of the very popular Swiss Sphinx Design, which is also a Swiss manufacturer designed handgun, although they make this sort of design chassis system for other pistols out there on the market, which I will explain in a moment. Now, this is intended to be a PDW, the original version being somewhat of a submachine gun, a defensive weapon meant to keep a very low and inconspicuous profile. As you can see here, there is a stock attachment point in the back for this to be SBR'd. A small folding stock would go along the side here, which could be quickly deployed by pushing on this latch button, allowing this to be used with more stability and more of a submachine gun PDW type of role. Now, this is an interesting concept and a little bit of a gap filler between what we know as a standard police or military sidearm and a full-size submachine gun or PDW like an AR-15 or M16, CAR-15 M4 type variant, which is typically used in roles of counterterrorism or special purpose police and military type of application. Now, the reason for this specific type of application to come into play and why there is such a gap filler now, we can mainly thank the global terrorism attacks that have been gearing up since the early 2000s mainly as the impetus for a design like this. Now, obviously, we here in the United States have not been foreign to terror attacks going back to 2001 and prior, as well as the domestic terror events that have been happening, such as mass shootings, unfortunately, that have been increasing here in the United States over the past years, but also in Europe as well. Through the early 2010s, we have seen terror attacks by ISIS in places like Great Britain, Germany, and in France. And that is where this would start to enter the picture. Now, most notably in 2015, there were a few terrorist attacks that made very large headlines. In January of 2015, there was an attack on the Charlie Hebdo facility due to some political cartoons involving Allah, which were published and put into supermarkets. Some ISIS fighters did not find that very funny, so they decided to go and shoot people over it, which is typically the nature of things like that. I believe 7 or 8 people were killed in that attack, as well as at a Jewish supermarket at the same time. Total casualties were around 17, including a police officer. And then later that year were the massive terror attacks that happened in Paris, outside of a soccer stadium, as well as during a rock concert and in various locations around the city streets, outside of cafes and restaurants in Paris, claiming the lives of about 130 innocent people in France. Now, this leads to a lot of debate over what type of armaments are appropriate for first responders. This is your general uniformed police officers to be carrying. There is a fine line between how militarized do you want your police force to be versus how well prepared do you want them to be to go and handle a situation where heavily armed terrorists are, they're up against, that type of armament and firepower. Now, in the 2015 Paris attacks, they actually had converted AKM, AK-47s, VZ-61 Scorpions, I believe, which were in fully automatic capacity. So they were sold as demilled rifles. They had been reactivated and then used. So the first responders were going up against fully automatic firepower, AK-47s and things like that. With handguns, they were grossly outgunned, especially if we look back at the January attacks. A police officer actually got into a firefight with 2 or 3 of the terrorists. He had a handgun and they had full auto AK-47s. He unfortunately ended up being killed, but did exchange fire and slow them down. So it was a very heroic move, which leads into how can we better arm our police to handle these sorts of engagements. Now, the philosophy in the past has always been to have specialized police response units, such as SWAT teams or gendarmerie or the GSG-9 or whatever country we're looking at. But typically, those are pulled from a variety of officers from different departments to get specialized training, and their availability is not always quick to be on the scene. They're usually not there as first responders. They are called in after the fact. And during these events, a lot of people can lose their lives in the minutes and sometimes hours it could take for them to assemble and arrive with superior firepower. Alternatively, do you want your police force, your general closed officers patrolling streets of, schools or supermarkets or airports or train stations, carrying CAR-15s and MP5s? So, a lot of people say, sure, that would be great. A lot of other people say, hey, that's way too intimidating and it makes us feel like a police state. So where do you draw the line? B&T decided to come up with an offering such as this. Now, previously, we're trying to fill the gap between things like this. This is mine. This is like a Glock 19, a little bit smaller than what most people would carry as a service sidearm. But this would be kind of like what a standard, uniformed officer might carry as a service sidearm, at least here in the United States. And then you have things like this. This is an AR-15 SBR. This is mine. This is a papered and registered SBR with 11.5-inch barrel. And this is something that like a specialized SWAT team or, related team would be using this, or like an MP5, which is a little bit smaller than this, but about that size. So how do you bridge the gap in firepower as well as the appearance? Well, B&T decided to come out with this. This is basically the Sphinx full-size pistol, which has been put in a chassis system, threaded barrel with optic, and you would have a stock on it. Now, to the unassuming non-gun person, if the stock were folded and were in this type of configuration and this is put into a holster, so you're really only seeing this come out of the service belt, it's not that assuming. It looks a little larger than a standard handgun, maybe a little bit more modern. But in the event of this police officer coming up against a terror unit, they could have this. I'm going to grab a magazine. They could have an extended magazine like this in their car or on their person ready to go out of sight. They can pop it in, deploy their stock, and then they have what is effectively a little PDW or submachine gun. This gives them a lot more firepower, especially if you have 3, 4, 5 officers with things like this showing up on the scene. This is way more firepower than something like this, like just a standard Glock 19, but also could be unassuming and easily concealed. There's also specialized police and military application as well for people who might have a role where they might not want to carry around a submachine gun or an M16 or a CAR-15 or an M4, but they want to have more firepower than, traditionally just like a Beretta M9 or a SIG M17. So they might carry something like this. This type of philosophy isn't entirely new. You have, even going back to the broom handle Mauser, the C96 had a quick deployable stock. The artillery Lugers had stocks in World War I. It was really meant for the same purpose. Easy to conceal and carry without having to worry about carrying a full-size rifle. But in cases, the limited cases where you get into a rough situation, you have way more firepower at your disposal as opposed to just your basic service sidearm. So a very cool firearm. They make this chassis system for the Glock 17 as well as the SIG P320. I don't know, there's probably a couple other handguns they make this for, but this is the traditional package right here. On the market today, brand new, they're in excess of $2,000. Used, you could probably find them for $1,500 or less, depending on condition. This one's got some notable wear on it. It's definitely had some rounds through it, so, a little bit less than that in terms of this one here. But very cool firearm. Very happy to get that one in and share it with you guys. That is the B&T USW, Universal Service Weapon A1. Okay, last but certainly not least is another B&T product that comes to us from our customer in South Carolina. Big thank you for selling us this one. This is the B&T APC-9, APC standing for Advanced Police Carbine. Now, this would come onto the market from the Swiss company B&T in 2011. However, the story with this would really go back to about 1966 with the development of probably the most popular submachine gun to ever be produced, and that was the H&K MP5. Now, the MP5 would actually begin to reshape the way the world would start thinking about submachine gun application with both military and police use. Prior to that, for example, in the Second World War, submachine guns were issued to frontline troops, mainly to squad leaders or NCOs, so that they could carry around a light maneuverable, lighter weight package because they were more concerned with directing the other elements of their squad. And in the event that they do end up getting in trouble, likely they are going to be in close quarters where they are most vulnerable. So having something that can produce a high volume of fire accurately to get them out of an emergency scenario, or an instance for them to have a PDW or personal defense weapon, was the main reason or main application for submachine gun use. Now, post-World War II, philosophies on this would start to change. Other submachine gun development like the Uzi out of Israel or the VZ61 out of Czechoslovakia would start to be produced as well. But the idea of this is that we're going to start issuing submachine guns to more specialized military and police units. These are going to be people who, if we look at the military, for example, are going to have very specific missions where maybe smaller groups or smaller teams are going to try and infiltrate quietly into close quarter, close confined, tighter spaces where they may not necessarily get involved in a firefight, but if they do, they have a personal defense weapon to be able to assist them where they can get high volumes of fire on their target quickly as a last means of self-defense. And that is where you start to see the brilliance of things like the MP5. Now, through the late 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, the MP5 would rule supreme, but by about the 90s to 2000s, most police forces and militaries around the world are starting to look for new technology, because by this time, the MP5 is about 4 or 5 decades old. Now, the MP5 was great and is still great and is still being used by police and military forces all over the world, but B&T would start thinking about new submachine gun technology, new ways to sort of reinvent the wheel. Now, they had worked with the MP9, which B&T actually still manufactures today. They have a semi-automatic civilian version known as the TP9. I have an SBR version of one of those on my channel. Go look at my shorts feed. You'll see a video of me firing one of those. And through what they had learned through the success with the MP9 weapon system that they had developed, they started coming out with new designs like this, a traditional configuration with a detachable box magazine in the front, similar to how an MP5 would work. Now, as mentioned, in 2011, this would be designed and implemented, and it was met with a lot of success, especially on commercial markets where it was used, and it has been adopted through different police and military forces as well. Now, in 2019, the United States military would actually put out a solicitation for a new weapon known as the SCW program, the Subcompact Weapon Program. And this is going to be a submachine gun type of firearm that was going to be used for specialized defense detachments, mainly for the Army. But I know that the Air Force has also adopted these as well. Now, because of that, in 2019, B&T would actually make some revisions to the APC carbine or submachine gun. They would use a modular interchangeable pistol grip, which the original APC-9 did not have. This can interchange with AR-15 or M16, A1, A2 pistol grips or anything that would fit that, so more modularity there. The bolt is designed to be able to feed off of Glock, SIG, and B&T magazines, so with a quick lower housing change, you can switch to different magazine patterns that you have firearms for. They would change the charging handle to these little folding paddles that are on both sides of the firearm, and they do not reciprocate. And I believe that's about it. They also came out with a tri-lug front device that would be compatible with other suppressors that were already in inventory with the military. Now, this is the standard APC-9 configuration this way. They also have a K model, which is a little bit shorter. That is the one that the military adopted, and it does come with a collapsing stock. Now, this has a stock adapter or attachment plate at the back, but of course you would have to form one it if you wanted to put a stock or a pistol brace on it under, you know, today's current climate. I don't know if the pistol brace thing will change in the future, but as of right now, you would have to form one it to turn it into an SBR if you want anything on the back end. Now, because of these changes in 2019, B&T would re-release this product to the consumer market, knowing it as the APC-9 Pro, and the Pro would indicate that it has these changes that have been made to it. Now, B&T also makes this in other calibers, and that is designated by the last 2 digits or 1 digit at the end of the name. So the APC-40 is in 40, the APC-45 is in 45. They also have a 10 millimeter known as the APC-10, so you guys get the idea. Very cool product. Just an excellent firearm all over, and anybody who's had experience with B&T products like this, like the GHM9 or the APCs, definitely tend to really like them. So they're just a really cool product. They also have the SD version of these that have an integrated suppressor. On the market today, brand new, these are over $2,000, typically between $2,000 to $2,500. Used, you're typically going to be in about the $1,500 plus or minus range, depending on condition and what they come with. But anyway, very, very cool firearm. Very happy to end this one out with this one. Again, the B&T APC-9 Pro. Well, that is all the time I have for you today on these. Thank you so much for stopping by and checking out this video. If you enjoyed, please let me know by hitting that like button. Please also consider subscribing to my channel and hit that bell notification button so you are aware when we are posting new content. We're going to leave you guys off with that. I am Chris with Marksman Shooting Sports and WeBuyGuns.com in Westfield, Indiana. You are watching Marksman TV, and we will see you next time.